I would really like, in this respect, to move to our next speaker here, which is, I don't think he needs much of an introduction. His name is Vincent Molinari. He's been in the business, I would say, for at least 30 years. He's a very experienced person when it comes to financial technologies and financial solutions. He used to be one of the very, very first to be recognizing the possibilities of blockchain for digitalizing existing assets as well as new assets. He's very, very motivated to push technologies in all sorts of spaces. Hi, Vince, there you are.
I'm sipping my tea.
No, I was just introducing you and just talking about your engagement that you have to bring these new technologies into spheres like, sustainable development goals, promoting financial inclusion. And I think one of the major drivers, as we discussed this week, was actually that this whole pandemic brought a tremendous push to digital information, where, of course, you just happen to be right on time again with Molinari Media pushing Fintech TV. I think, you're not going to say that yourself, but I will. He's just made a magnificent merger with connecting to Southeast Asia Fintech television, as well as Asia and Africa and India. So we're going to see a lot more of Molinari Media, I guess. I'll leave you to explain to us what this recent period is going to mean for the information technology for all of us within this field of blockchain, financial inclusion, and everything else that's interesting in digital assets and sustainable development goals. Floor is yours, Vincent.
Wow, with an introduction like that, Annemieke, oh my goodness. Well, thank you so much. And really honored, and it's a privilege to be on a platform with so many legends and icons, and really super tough act to follow going after Eric. But there's so much in his presentation that fully aligns with our thoughts of where we are, where we're going, and in fact, where we came from. So I think my talk in talking about decentralized communities is a little bit of reflecting of the personal journey, and as Annemieke quite pointed out, a little bit old, as we've been through a few cycles over the past 3 decades or so that I've been around technology and capital formation. So for us, and thank you, Molinari Media, as the new venture, which is has a OTT channel, Fintech TV, and a couple of cornerstone shows in the impact that focuses on, as you pointed out, Annemieke, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, climate change, ESG investing, and the Digital Asset Report, which I'd like to focus a bit on, because that really tells the story, I think, of where we have come from in many ways and where we're going. And then I'd love to talk a bit about where we see content. And again, props to Eric, and thank you for teeing up so much of the digital identity and to some degree, many would say, the sovereignty of oneself and the ownership of that data. And now more and more the ability to monetize that data directly to the individual versus lots of the corporations that Eric referenced that have been doing that for any number of years. So historically have been in financial services, again, throwing back to Eric, even before it was fashionable to call it fintech. Right now, we can be DeFi, we can be blockchain, we can be all kinds of things. So really, it represents a journey, an evolution to me. And so much of it is the modernization of, in many cases, securities law, other laws to intersect with the most innovative technologies. And really, it's about education awareness and understanding and putting forward the new narratives and the stories that aren't being told. And for us, that really started with the Digital Asset Report by accident. And I frankly am not a content person by background, but really reflecting and looking at stories that weren't being told and why they weren't being told, and demystifying subjects around what really is blockchain technology itself relative to Bitcoin in the early days, to what decentralization really means, what the benefits of interoperability can be, the ability to cross border. When we talk about these disconnects or incongruity that we have around information and information asymmetry, where we can utilize technologies and smart contracts, wallets to create symmetry of information so it's in real time and immutable. And then if you let your mind wander, what that really means and its applications to identity, to alternative payment systems, to altcoins and currencies, to its impact on the evolution of our financial service systems themselves, and the harmonization of those with the new and efficient technologies. We came out the other side of that, really looking through the digital asset report, was really these conversations, if you could think about that, we had starting at the New York Stock Exchange. And that show to really bring thought leaders, legislators, policymakers, disruptors, the best innovators around cryptography to have these conversations and to broadcast that. And I think it was kind of an interesting hybrid to have the New York Stock Exchange studios where we broadcast from, but to be having these differentiating conversations. And those conversations we found over the next 18 months were consumed widely on a globalized basis, close to 7 million views. And it was really quite interesting, where we saw quite a bit of engagement outside of the US, Asia specifically. So we took those learnings and began to realize what the market is really looking for is differentiating content that speaks to what's important today that isn't being spoken about, or perhaps being distributed on mainline television networks, either because they have a vested interest perhaps to protect in some level of decentralized content, or they just didn't have the domain experts because so much of this was early. So we took those lessons learned and really built a business franchise around it, utilizing, again, what I would say, looking at fourth industrial revolution technologies, blockchain, AI, IoT. How do we take the front end content creation? And again, thank you, Anamika, because this launch now has taken us globally. And this is where we get into thinking about decentralized communities, technologies that we've had available that we're now able to accelerate. And maybe I think as part of Erica did also pointed out earlier, that we've had these technologies, but it's the acceptance, the understanding, where so much of it has been demystified globally in its usage. And I would say also have been accelerated by COVID-19 globally, where we've had to advance very quickly to much of the infrastructure that was built and underutilized. So the dissemination of information, we call it actionable knowledge. The more information and knowledge that we can put into the system, the more likely someone's going to take an action. And that action is some level of engagement, depending upon what you're looking for. So with the digital asset report, we're very fortunate that we now broadcast from not only the New York Stock Exchange, but NASDAQ, and most recently, London Stock Exchange Studios, a new wonderful partnership that will be quite prolific for us, we believe, with Asia Times Financial, partnering into India, as well as Africa with Frontline Media. So that the signals to us are quite strong that content consumption in a decentralized format, streaming, and other methodologies around things that people care about, things that speak to how do we improve the environment, how do we improve our communication, how do we improve our workplace, how do we improve capital formation and inclusion, how do we use identity in new ways to monetize those. So as we look at this scaling, I think what, again, I just love that Eric was sharing his insights because it fits so well when you then begin to think about what we call on the back end of the consumption of content, right? Data consumption exhaust. Very much how stock exchanges around the world make so much money is through their data feeds. Those data feeds come from the transactions, the money flows that are occurring on the exchange. So if we think of that model and say, well, what is happening as we have decentralized networks, as we have fan base, diaspora communities, affinity groups that are consuming content, and because of AI, behavioral patterning, we can really understand deeply what's being consumed by why and who. And now if you can change the model to then say to those participants who we can embed onto a blockchain, who have a wallet, who have their digital identity, to say, well, there are sponsors, there are advertisers, there are others who are seeking to engage with you because you are in a specific demographic, a specific geography. You have an affinity for a cause that they'd like to engage with you. Well, it is then the power being returned to the individual to decide who they want to engage with, what level of information or their personal data that they'd like to share further. And by sharing further, there isn't a reward base that's baked in, if you would, level of compensation that individual then could decide how much they want to share with and with what entities. So we're changing the paradigm and the control of that data, I believe, on the back end based upon the consumption to the individual versus the large entities who are largely scraping or capturing that way, that data in ways that maybe aren't necessarily in keeping with that individual and perhaps going deep into certain levels of privacy. So it is a long way around to describe how we see the globe changing, how we see this rapid adoption and demand side generated for content that is relevant, that is timely, that is being distributed in real time, and frankly, to attract the thought leaders around the world to be able to amplify their voices, to elevate the stories of the company's projects, initiatives, and policies that they're advancing that aren't being heard on mainstream media distribution. So you really have seen a groundswell of dissemination of information and data around this paradigm shift. And I believe that the next leg of the conversation really becomes what that content consumption tells us. What story within the story is in there, the levels of importance. And when we begin to tie that to things that really matter in the world, how do we help make improvements to our planet, some of the most pressing issues that we have in humanity? How do we tie that level of education and awareness around a cause, around an issue that is going on around the world, to give it visibility, and then to have people have a seamless way to be able to engage? And that could be investing, that could be donation, that could be just about learning more to have visibility. You begin to really blossom from within of how you change engagement. And that engagement, I think, is the permanency of what we're beginning to experience, that certainly blockchain digital is not going away. And in fact, if anything, as we talked about a little bit earlier, our experience with COVID has accelerated that. And again, I'm going to continue to reference you, Eric, as you talked about legislation and the president and things that are going on. When we started our advocacy 2.5 years ago around much of blockchain digital, the engagement with the US regulators, my goodness, I've looked at being very basic of having to distill what blockchain really was 2.5 years ago, to writing over 20 pieces of regulatory and legislative advocacy, to FINRA, SEC, CFTC, and 4 sets of US congressional testimony. And I say that just because we've been in the weeds, in the trenches, and we had a tough time having people pay attention. Well, in just the last 3 months since COVID, because of the issues that you pointed out, Eric, of seamless delivery ability of having wallets for care and stimulus package, there's over 33 bills in US Congress that are floating around that have some level of digital engagement So when we talk about the conversation being elevated, now moving to action within the US and all jurisdictions around the world, we just happen to know the US data points a little bit better, but it's thematically to how this engagement now marries to the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. How do we engage with individuals to lift people from poverty? How do we move the world from scarcity to surplus? Because just as we've had the technologies at our hand that we haven't brought to bear just yet, and we're starting to, we have the abilities and the technologies and the desire, particularly in fourth industrial revolution technologies, to lift our planet from scarcity to surplus. So it's a long way around of our views of where we see decentralized communities becoming more powerful and their engagement in forming and influencing policy, legislation, engagement, wealth transference, and really that baseline of consumption and creation of data that begins to tell us stories, and we hear much more signals through all the noise. So I think that's just about my 15 minutes, Anamika, and so grateful to you, to DNA for putting this forth, and look forward in the future how we can collaborate.
We have some questions for you. I think it's very interesting that you bridged what Eric said about data collection, that data is the new goal, digital identity, and that you made the bridge towards, well, I would say awareness, a seamless opportunity as an individual to engage with things that you think are worth your attention, basically, that you have a passion for, that is a cause that you would like to engage with. How do you see this process working? I mean, you're on the information side. You give the public information about all these possibilities. On the other hand, we just heard Eric about digital identity. How do you see these two bridges? Because I think you seamlessly flew, from his subject into your world of, I would say, information, basically, real information, digital asset reports, sustainable development goals. How do you see this?
Well, I think, again, was seamless in Eric's conversation, and again, maybe by design of yourself, of how you stacked the flow. But I think it's seamless because it is all connected, right? So, I think it starts at the top level when we think about education and awareness, when we think about putting forth information and data and stories that aren't being told. So when you create the content and the ability, particularly in a decentralized format, when you can think about so many different ways to distribute content, you're reaching populations in mass that you couldn't have afforded from an economic standpoint without Moore's law, without the efficiency of technology, right? So technology here, creation of information here, and disseminating that. Now, when you receive that, you receive something that you haven't received before. So it stimulates thoughts. Well, you may not even known what a digital asset was or what the Sustainable Development Goals were. You may not have even known that you have a connectivity in your heart and mind to Sustainable Development number 5 on gender equality and financial inclusion. But wow, that makes sense. Well, it really makes sense to have SDG number 3 for wellness and health. Wow, I could relate to that. So then if you're starting to consume data and content around that, it goes directly to Eric's point to say the ownership ability, again, because of technology, has given me the ownership to control my data, my digital gold myself, and to use a bad analogy or not, that I get to self-mine that at my decision.
Yeah.
To whom? So I think it is all very symbiotic and part of the new ecosystem, if we want to overuse that word here, right, of how the layers of connectivity and, dare I say, interoperability around, again, it touches finance, it touches identity, it touches privacy. It is also interconnected. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but it was another ramble.
Yeah, well, it's always interesting to hear that, but I think if you look at the past, I would say 2 decades, there's been a lot of criticism on individualism. Okay, it's just me, and the rest doesn't matter. We got more to our phones, we got more individual. Do you think that this new era will give individuals much more, I would say almost again, a form of collaborative communities to just, I would say, put themselves behind the causes and the information that really matter to them? Actually, a new stage of, I would say, owning your own digital identity, owning your own opinions, owning information to your choice, and that way creating, I would say, a second stage in being an individual, which is being an individual in part of a cause, a community, that type of thing, is what I sort of take away from what you just said.
I think it's, again, part of a journey. So when we were having conversations here in the US, pre the US Jobs Act, right, and we were writing about the integration of social media and finance as a new distribution channel, frankly, people thought we were crazy, right? And over time, right, and maybe we are, that became part of the Jobs Act, right, and changed for the first time in US history the ability to advertise a security for sale. So that change, right, now it's common, right, after 10 years. And if we look at the impact, right, and not directly to your point, but here we are since the implementation of the Jobs Act in the United States, that the issuance of unregistered securities is twofold of our public securities, 3.6 trillion a year to 1.5 trillion. Why? Again, because of technology. So I'm a little torn where we look at how deeply this goes, right? And I could see AR and VR being embedded into the processes, right? As we become more engaged with our devices. So, when I look at my children that are 16 to 26, their level of engagement on devices, where I say, get off your phone, get off your, get out there and play, all the things that we do as parents. But I'll tell you this, the transition has been seamless through COVID. They're having movie gatherings virtually and watching movies with friends on shared device and hanging out. So I think we are well down a pathway, if you would, of this immersion with our technologies that are going to continue to morph and have huge impacts on our communities, and bringing some things much closer and other things maybe further away as part of the process.
I want to thank you a lot for your contribution today, Vincent. I'm sure we talk a lot more about, we can talk for days about these subjects, I know that.